CEO of Ellig Group, Executive Search Advisors, and I'm really delighted to be welcoming everybody here today for what I know will be a very informative, exciting, and inspiring and inspirational discussion and conversation with Holly and with Nicole. So before we get going, I just wanted to say that these webinars are intended to really address some of the big issues and concerns that we hear from our clients, our colleagues, and our friends. I wanted to introduce the two individuals who are truly experts in the field of corporate governance. And I will say that I've just already gotten a question on this, that you will be able to ask questions at the end, and we will get to as many as we can. And where we don't have the time, we will put it in the report and send that out to you. Additionally, this will then all be on my website, so you can access it after this webinar. The other point that I want to make is that you can tune into other webinars that are going to be going forward, and they'll all be listed on my website as well. So I wanted to start with Nicole Sandford, who leads Ellig Group's Global Board Advisory Practice, where she engages boards and CEOs around the most strategic elements of governance, including director and executive search and succession planning, board skill development, and governance process improvement. Nicole joined Ellig Group after nearly 3 decades at Deloitte, where she led the firm's regulatory and operational risk practice and advised clients on governance, crisis response, and regulatory risk management. She was also a founding member of Deloitte's Center for Corporate Governance. Holly Gregory is someone I'm sure you all have known and read about and heard her speak many times, is co-chair of Sidley Austin's Corporate Governance and Executive Compensation Practice, where she is an authority on counseling boards, special committees, and management on the full range of governance issues, including in highly sensitive situations. Holly played a key role in drafting OECD's Principles of Corporate Governance and the NACD Key Agreed Principles of Corporate Governance. Holly recently completed her term as chair of the American Bar Association Corporate Governance Committee and led the ABA task force that delivered the report on the delineation of governance roles and responsibilities to Congress and the SEC in 2009. Holly has many recognitions. I'm going to just highlight 2. She was named by NACD directorship as one of 100 of the most influential players in corporate governance in 2019, and has held that position as one of the top 100 for all prior years that the NACD has been doing this. And she is the current president of the American College of Governance Council. We have 2 experts in this field of corporate governance, and to address the issue of lessons in a shifting paradigm where boards of directors are under such pressures day to day and minute to minute. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Holly Gregory and Nicole Sandford and start off with the question. So Holly, there have been many past events, 9/11, financial crisis, and boards had unforeseen calls and conditions and issues that they had to deal with. But this is a worldwide pandemic, unprecedented. How are boards to deal with the situation today?
Well, thank you, Janice, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And to the participants, I hope all of you and your families and your colleagues are weathering the challenges that are posed by the pandemic. Clearly, we're operating in a very unusual set of circumstances, and as a threshold matter, I think it's important to understand that the legal responsibilities of the board and the legal duties of directors are very durable. They don't change in a time of crisis. That said, the activities of the board and the way that directors engage to fulfill their legal obligations change significantly. And I'm sure you're all feeling it already. It's both a matter of the areas that the board is needing to focus on, a matter of the level of detail of information that you're all receiving and are reviewing, and the time and attention generally that's required. So in a time of crisis, you really ramp up. You're having more board meetings as management works to make sure that you're fully informed and that they have the benefit of your good advice and direction. Now, clearly, the duties that directors owe are well known. the duty to act prudently in good faith and in the best interests of the corporation. And as it's sometimes said, the best interests of the corporation and the interests of the shareholders. Now that concept is a theoretical concept in a way, in as much as shareholders are very diverse, and so the interests of the shareholders are very diverse. And the important thing is that directors, the board of directors, has discretion. It's their job to decide just what the best interests of the corporation is. I say that because there's been a lot of talk about stakeholders and governance responsibility to stakeholders. You may recall that in August of 2019, the Business Roundtable, a group of almost 200 CEOs, put out a statement emphasizing that in running the corporation, they're focused on the interests of a range of stakeholders and not just shareholders. And that's because corporations are really there to provide goods and services, and they don't do that successfully unless they're meeting the fair expectations of a range of constituents. And this is a practical requirement, not a legal requirement, but we're seeing it in very real time today. When you watch the news every morning, what we're hearing about are all the activities that corporations are taking to make sure that their employees and their customers are safe. They're focused on worker and customer health and safety. They're focused on keeping our grocery shelves stocked and working on vaccines, and even turning their usual product focus away from normal manufacturing PPE and ventilators. So a long way of saying your duties aren't changed, but the way in which you're going to be asked to focus is very much changed. And I'm sure we'll get into that in more detail in a little bit.
Nicole, you would like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this in terms of board dynamics. I think it's important to remember that in times of stress, people tend to rely more on their dominant personality or management style. So it's a question of self-awareness. So as a board member, thinking about if you're a person who requires a lot of information and time to analyze, understanding that that's not likely to be an option for you in this environment, and trying to be self-aware as to how that management style might impact the board's ability to move forward. But it's also about board leadership and recognizing, if you're the chair of the board or even just a member of the board, that your fellow directors are likely to also revert to their strongest character. And so people who tend to be hard driving in the boardroom are potentially going to be even more hard driving. And as a board member, trying to help the management team to manage that is really important, because you need to keep moving forward, and the roles and responsibilities of the board versus the management team cannot get blurred in this critical time frame. So thinking about the board's responsibilities to conduct themselves appropriately, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that to get dicey, and I think being aware of it is the most important thing to do right now.
And I would suppose as lead directors and chairs, it's really a responsibility to keep that dialogue and that good conversation going, and asking the unexpected, or putting forth the things that people aren't thinking about, and saying, what are we going to do next? But keeping that conversation so everybody is speaking at that table and
That's
informed.
right.
So management is responding quickly these days, as I said, sometimes minute to minute. What pressure does this put on the board from a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that management is responding appropriately? Is there any legality, or legal issues that could come up down the road with such actions? So what do boards need to consider, and what do they need to ask in terms of some of those key questions around the decisions that are being made, as I said, sometimes just in a nanosecond, because they have to?
Your legal duties and responsibilities change, but when a situation arises, you're required.
I'm sorry, could you start over, Holly? Because I think your voice went out for a moment. When I stopped, just wait 5 seconds and then start. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that better? So as I said a moment ago, fiduciary duties and responsibilities of the boards don't change, but because directors are required to be prudent, that means they have to be changing how they focus depending on the situation that they're in. And so in a crisis situation, which this is, we expect directors and boards to be much more engaged. As I said at the outset, you're probably having weekly meetings or every other week meetings. A lot of those meetings are focused on making sure you're informed about the decisions management is taking, but also there are points at which you need to be providing guidance. And as Nicole said, a lot of this is about listening to the information and asking good questions and challenging assumptions. So I think the first priority we've all seen, boards have been focused, as I said before, on health and safety of employees and customers. And this is going to continue to require your attention, both as to the policies that are in place, as things develop and change, and as to the communications that the company is making. In addition, in the early days, we expect boards to be spending some time on fine-tuning their approach to crisis management, really making sure that we've got the right teams in place, cross-functional teams, that there's ability to respond quickly and decisively, that there are contingency plans, and that there's a good communication plan. I think the next thing that we see boards focus in on are issues around operational and risk oversight. And largely right now, that's about business continuity. So I see boards spending a lot of time, and I expect that they will be for some time, on financial impact of the crisis, on issues of liquidity, disruption in talent and the supply chain and production. Of course, internal controls and the audit function are always really important in a crisis. And then thinking about incentives. How are we incentivizing our team to undertake the kinds of actions we need? And this is very difficult in a crisis like this. So there should be probably more focus of your compensation committee on how are we compensating people, and are there going to be some unexpected impacts based on how we had set up our compensation plans. We also see boards spending a lot of time on key person risks, which is really emergency succession planning, and also on board and governance continuity. And finally, thinking about not just the risks, but the strategic opportunities that are presented. For example, opportunities to weigh in and fill an unmet need in a crisis. And we're seeing many companies do that. Opportunities that are occasioned by the pandemic itself. And we're also seeing opportunities for growth through distressed M&A. One last thing though, don't forget about making sure that you're well positioned for defense against shareholder activism and hostile situations. There are still hedge funds out there with significant amounts of money, and we're seeing, and they will come in. And we are seeing companies dust off their poison pills to make sure that they're on the shelf and ready if they're needed.
That's a key point. Right, there is still money on the side, may go in and affect the operation and the governance and representation on that board. Thank you, Holly. Nicole?
Yeah, I think similar to Holly's perspective, I think there's two issues that are sort of tied for first place in my mind, which is liquidity and employee safety. And I think when you're looking at liquidity, it's up to the board to really step back and assess the competency of the team that's running models and looking at this issue. Clearly, financial services institutions have very large teams that know how to run models. That's what they do for their business. I would guess that a lot of other companies in different industries maybe don't have the bench strength around that skill set and may actually be trying to learn on the fly or learn on the job, which I don't think is a particularly great strategy. So it might be worthwhile for the board or the audit committee or the risk committee to ask some questions about the models that are being run and suggest if it's clear that we don't have the strength in the finance organization or within the treasury function, for example, to get some outside help. There are really talented people who have access to a wide variety of modeling techniques, and there's no reason to try to create something when you can get something that really is going to work for you right away, and also gives you more flexibility to run scenarios. You may need to be running multiple variables to understand what's about to happen if certain things happen within your supply chain or with your employee workforce. You want to be able to run those models quickly and understand what levers you can pull to respond to them. And that's a specialized skill set that the board should make sure the management team has or is hiring very quickly. Same goes with the board. These are not normal circumstances. You may not have enough insight or understanding or prior experience to really push back on the models that are being presented, not in a adversarial way, but in a way that gives you comfort that you understand what you're being presented with. And we do not want to recommend getting in a situation of dueling consultants. That's not what I'm suggesting. But if the board collectively doesn't believe that they have the skills they need to understand the potential impact from a liquidity perspective, or even from a workplace safety perspective, it's probably a good time to address that.
Those are all great points. Now, let me throw out what we have all talking about. It's the unprecedented, unimaginable, right, that has happened to us. I walk down New York City streets with my mask, my gloves. They're empty. The streets are empty. These are absolutely times that we've never seen before. So what should a board think about in terms of the unimaginable scenarios that could happen to the board or to the senior team? Suppose the CEO gets the virus, senior team members, a lot of them.
Mhm.
And we've already heard about some that have passed away, unfortunately. And what if the board, half of the board gets the virus and you can't do a vote? In those situations, those unimaginable, unpredictable, unforeseen, never happened before because Mother Nature has taken over here. What do, Holly? How do you prepare for those events?
And your question does suppose the answer. You need to be prepared, right? You need to be prepared because for the unimaginable, the unthinkable. You need to have a plan for disruption in your senior most executive ranks. The board needs to have a good understanding of who is prepared to step in temporarily if CEO, CFO, general counsel, chief operating officer, heads of business departments are suddenly down sick for a week or two during this crisis and really can't focus. And you also need to have, so that's kind of a really temporary succession plan because it's not true succession. You also need to have a more durable emergency succession plan if the horrible happens and these individuals who become sick don't come back to it. And that most boards have done that for CEOs, but maybe they haven't thought about it down the ranks a bit. And you really do need to think about it for any of the senior executive officers that the board essentially appoints. In addition, think about, there are going to be disclosure requirements. And so you need to be prepared that you may have to face difficult questions about what do we disclose about the CEO and his or her illness and when. Now, the 8K requirement requires disclosure if someone is in that position is incapacitated and unable to perform their job. But we are seeing many boards and companies deciding to disclose sooner than that in the interest of we don't know if this is going to get worse, and so we'll have something down the road, and in trying to manage things. So, of course, you have to weigh that with privacy issues around people's health. People have really strong privacy rights around their medical information. So those are things boards need to be prepared to think about and talk about. I think in addition, your point, Janice, about planning for disruption at the board level. So we know that boards can only take action when there is a quorum present. What happens if there are so many members of the board who are ill or worse that you can't bring a quorum together for some kind of key decision that a committee is not allowed to make a decision on? And there are areas of that. For example, a decision to put the company into bankruptcy is not one that a committee can make. It can't be delegated to an executive committee. There are other decisions like that. So you need to plan for that disruption. How do you do that? I would review your quorum provisions in your bylaws And remember that under Delaware law and the law of some other states, you could have a quorum provision that's as low as 1/3 of the board. Now, there are reasons why you may not want that in normal times, but you could have a trigger in your bylaws that say, in the case the president has declared a national emergency, our quorum reduces down to 1/3. There's another thing to be aware of, that the Delaware statute and many other state statutes allow for companies in good times, like now, before the crisis that's impacting the availability to bring the board together, to provide for emergency bylaw provisions. And I had a colleague take a look at this last night. Only 20 of the Fortune 100 have these bylaw provisions in place. So I would suggest, if you're a director on this call, you go back and say, do we have that emergency bylaw provision that we're allowed to have under Delaware law if you're a Delaware corporation? Should we think of having it? And what it essentially does, it allows the board or whoever is available on the board in a crisis to make some key decisions. And it's an important protection to have in place.
You know, I'm going to ask Nicole to address that, but also, Nicole, as we are doing executive search for boards going forward, and also for senior executives, this teaches us a little bit of a lesson in terms of what you need in certain positions. The character, the courage, the mettle to do what needs to be done, right? Either in a C-suite position and or on the board. Would you address that in terms of what you see coming out of this as lessons learned in really managing board responsibilities through this shifting paradigm and a new reality, as I call it?
Right. Well, we've seen that play itself out a few times in the last few decades. We have seen certain skill sets that were almost missing from boards become very commonplace. For example, financial expertise in the wake of the financial scandals at the turn of the century, risk management expertise, and some real deep industry expertise for financial institutions coming out of the financial crisis. Certainly, I think we'll see that on the other side of this as well. And I think it's always about dynamics. And we all know, I mean, we're three people who are passionate about board diversity. And we know that when we work with a board that is very dysfunctional or that doesn't perform well in these kinds of situations, in many cases, they have one thing in common, and it's that they do not have any diversity on the board. So I hope that this will continue that movement forward. And we have seen it accelerate initiatives around skill sets and diversity in the past. And I think that will be the case here as well. Going back to the question around planning for the unthinkable situation with management, we all hope that is not the case, absolutely. But I think this is one of those situations where the board has a special role to play that's a little bit more active than just a typical oversight role. I think the board does need to ask the CEO some very direct questions and keep asking those questions throughout this crisis. Where are they getting their information about the virus and their personal health and safety? What are they doing to modify their behavior in terms of, are they still going to the office? And if so, are they doing it because it's necessary or because it's convenient and comfortable? Who else is going there with them? Are all of their deputies still meeting in person? Are their executive assistants coming to the office still? How about at home? What kind of social distancing practices are they implementing at home? These are really important questions. I think getting back to what Holly said earlier also, once you know who the potential successors are for your key roles, those people should not be working physically together at any point from here on in, and making sure that management is really thinking in those terms. I think in normal times, we all love to have a CEO who puts the company first and themselves second. I don't think that's going to work here. I think we need the CEO and his key people that are managing this crisis to understand that if they get sick, if they get taken out of their key role, it is going to have a much bigger impact than taking some basic care of themselves and being smart about modifying their behavior. And I think it's also important, going back to the other issue we talked to earlier about employee safety. We all know, we've seen it 100 times. Employees will model their behavior based on what they see their leaders doing, not based on what their leaders are saying. If the boss is still coming to the office, if the boss is not taking social distancing seriously, the people around the boss will not. And that cascades all the way through. So I think it's important for the board to really ask some good questions. There are certainly industries and companies where the management team still needs to be on the ground. I'm not implying otherwise. But in a lot of cases, I think it's just not comfortable for people to shift their behavior. And I think the board has to make sure that the CEO and his executive team or her executive team is being very thoughtful about their personal safety and health.
We had a question that came in. How many boards, if you know, have emergency succession plans in place? Because the role of the chair or lead director becomes essential in terms of leadership during these times. Do we have a sense of how many have those emergency succession plans? Holly?
I think emergency succession plans, the famous succession plan in the drawer, so if you get hit by a bus, for the CEO, is there at most companies. And so on the executive side, what we're talking about is making sure you've gone down a bit more and that you really understand it. And you've thought about both temporary and more longer term disabilities or incapacities. On the board side and the lead director side, the board leadership roles, it's a very good question because you don't typically have lined up in advance who the next lead director will be or who the next non-executive chair will be. And so giving some thought to that may be good. The difficulty is, and frankly, when we're dealing with boards, we're already dealing with a population of older people who we know are more vulnerable. By definition, most directors are 60 and over. So you could plan who the next lead director is, but there's just as much a chance in a small group of people that person may also be affected. So I think some thought to it, maybe a thought that we'll go down the list of committee chairs in the immediate. If our lead director or executive chairman or non-executive chairman is out of commission, then we'll go to the audit committee or the governance committee, work down that way. But I do think it's a great question and key in that succession planning to think about those kinds of issues. I think you also have to think about, for public companies, what if we have our 3-person audit committee and suddenly we have a 1-person audit committee? Now we're also out of compliance with the listing rules and what do we do in those circumstances? Now there are provisions in the listing rules for short periods of time where you aren't in compliance, but there should be some thought given to that.
I've spoken to a number of directors in terms of what's happening, not the specifics, anything confidential, but in terms of how things are being handled. And several have said, the CEO and the board has just been phenomenal in terms of how things are unfolding and how they're managing it. Some have not been as complimentary. So you wrote an article, 10 considerations for boards of directors during the COVID-19 pandemic. How does one evaluate the senior team and how things are unfolding during this unprecedented event?
I think boards have to evaluate them the way they've always evaluated them, by listening carefully. Right now, if your senior management teams are not providing you with more information than usual, and you're not holding more board meetings than usual, I would say you need to question why that's so. And really focus in. But your assessment really isn't any different. You've got to be guided by the circumstances and bring your best judgment about what is prudent. What should we be hearing about? What should we be focusing on? I'm glad you pointed out that article. I hope everyone has access to it, but it is a good kind of quick summary of where boards should be focused. And I covered some of that earlier, but I think it does provide some good, it's meant to provide some good comfort that if we're doing these things, we're probably pretty much on top of, we're not ignoring a known issue.
We have another question here. What happens to the annual proxy process, shareholders meetings, et cetera, and requirements for publicly traded companies during this time of crisis?
Yes, absolutely. So we're seeing a large number of companies. We're seeing, they're going into proxy season and they're shifting their meetings to virtual meetings. That was always possible for Delaware companies, but it wasn't until recently, I believe last week or so, that, for example, the New York governor passed an executive order allowing for virtual meetings for companies that didn't already have those, that have some capacity in their bylaws. So there are a big shift to holding your annual meeting virtually, so they still go on. There, of course, are different, there needs to be sensitivity to disclosure requirements. You need to be thinking about how the pandemic impacts all of the company's normal disclosures. So we are seeing boards have to spend more time on those issues, things like risk factors, the whole range of how are we positioned, how is our guidance, what do we need to do to update. Those are all very key issues. But the proxy season will go on.
That's comforting. Okay, so another question that is here from our participants. We are in a crisis mode and focused on the here and now in board meetings, supporting management through the crisis. However, the board also needs to talk about the post-COVID environment. Any thoughts on when is the right time for that? That's a great question for both of you.
It is a great question. Nicole, do you want to go first on this?
I will just, because I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, Holly. So very quickly, I will just say, one of the things that I've seen be a real challenge is after the crisis is over, having the board return to normal operating, like knowing when it's time to stop the weekly meetings, the daily meetings, knowing when it's time to get back towards more oversight and maybe, a little less fingers in kind of an approach is absolutely critical for the long-term success of the company and the board. And we've both seen plenty of examples where that was not easy, an easy transition. So I love that someone's thinking that way because it's absolutely critical to be thinking about it. Holly, I'd love your insight as to when.
I think this is a great question. The 10th item on my list of 10 considerations for boards is think about the aftermath. Think about it in a couple of ways. And I didn't list the one you noted, Nicole, but that's a really good one. Think about how do you return to normalcy. I think boards need to think about what will normal look like? How will our business be changed forever potentially by this pandemic? So for example, we may see far fewer people doing any shopping by retail. Retail was already declining, but this may cause a real shift. We may see people more used to and comfortable and expecting to work remotely. How else might things change? We may see a move away from very, very big meetings and conventions and things like that. That may cause concern, or if you are holding them with a different set of health and safety parameters in place. This is going to change how we do business. It's also going to provide some opportunities, I'm sure. I'm not smart enough to know what those all are, but I think in the areas of technology, there are probably some kinds of technology fixes that we're going to be looking for in our business lives. I think the other component, and so starting to think now what the world might look like in the future, I think it's not too early to start doing that, but that is a bit of crystal ball gazing that always becomes clearer as time passes and we get closer to the end of this. I think the other thing to really focus in on, and this you can't really do till more closer to the end, is what are the lessons learned about our own processes and how we get ready for the next one. So, I was talking to the former chair of our firm yesterday, and talking about how the leadership of my law firm, Sidley Austin, has approached the pandemic. And I was saying I feel like we're in really, really good hands. And he was talking about how the playbook from 9/11, when we had people in that building, in the buildings that came down, and then the playbook from the 2008 financial crisis have helped in many ways. But we're going to learn more from this playbook. And we're going to need to think about what could we shore up in our processes, and what do we learn, and how do we make sure that we bring some benefit from having gone through this horrific experience, so that we continue to be resilient in the future.
Holly, do you think that there might even be a special committee set up to kind of work with management in terms of looking at something like this down the road?
Yeah, I think different companies are going to handle that in different ways. I'm always a little bit concerned about proliferation of committees and special committees and things, but I think for some companies it may make sense. For some companies, you know, the potential change in business, like for retailers, is going to be significant. And they've already been, you know, feeling that pain significantly for a while. It's just now really, really stark. And I do think that we will have fewer people operating that way.
We're running short on time. There is one more question, and we may have to report on this in writing later, but can you provide any more specific information regarding the provision in Delaware corporate law that allows for change in quorum requirements during national emergencies? Can you answer that quickly, or should we do that?
It's Delaware codes. It's 110 of the General Business Corporations Act. And I'm happy to talk offline with anybody who'd like to explore it. But as I said, only about 20 of the top Fortune 100 companies have this in place now. Now, I haven't looked at all state laws, but I do believe that many have a similar provision, if not, probably not identical, but similar.
Well, I want to thank our speakers. You've been absolutely phenomenal, and I hope you'll come back, as this was not going to end tomorrow. We will be putting together a report of the key points you've made. It'll be available on LinkedIn and then our website, elliggroup.com. Somebody asked me about the article that you referenced before that you co-authored, Holly, which is 10 considerations for boards of directors during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's available on the Sidley Austin website. Is that right?
That's correct. It's also on the Harvard Corporate Governance blog. I would say that we wrote this in the middle of March, and I've already thought that there are things I'd like to change in it, because parts of it read like it's early in the crisis, and I think we know more now.
Well, I'm sure this conversation is going to generate more questions, so I look forward to getting those questions from our participants so that we can respond to you directly and or have another session, a webinar with Holly and Nicole. So I want to thank our audience. Stay well, stay safe, and we will be back. Thank you very much for joining us.